If you wanted to go to the games, you went across the street. There was a big market, later called Trajan's Market. The tickets were terracotta discs, like a coin basically. And it had two numbers on it. It had a section number and a seat number. The section number corresponded to the gate, but each arch opened to a different section. But during the intermissions, if you decided you'd like to have a prostitute, you could look up to that ring above you and kind of wave at one like, hey, you know. They would meet you at the gate, and the business was transacted right there in the gate. Well, what's an arched doorway called in Latin? It's called a fornis. It's where we get our word fornication. Well, what I wanted to do today was just ask the question, was Jesus effective? Did he change our world? And so I wanted to look at, two or three aspects of Roman life, the way it was when he was born, and then what happened because of him. The Romans valued nothing more than strength. They loved strength and power. If you look at the way Romans wrote history, was whether it was Jews or Gauls or Britons, the people they were conquering, they wanted to portray them as like super, super strong and heroic. So you have these like paintings of a dying Gaul and things like that. And it's like they look really heroic and kind of sad. And so Romans could be like, oh, wow, but aren't we awesome because we killed him? No thought to human rights, human dignity, things like that. They didn't think that way at all. And so Jesus is born into this brutal, brutal world. And there was no symbol. There was nothing embodied the brutality of that Roman world more than the two or three things I want to talk about today. I want to talk about Gladiatorial Games, Crucifixion, and Infanticide. Let's start with Infanticide. So in the Roman world, it was totally normal to kill babies. Nobody cared. And you know it was common even if you just know literature. You have these stories like Oedipus Rex, where they just abandoned the baby. This was normally done, by the way. They would just take a baby, a newborn, so it can't live more than a few hours by itself, and just leave it by the side of a road, just let it die, or leave it on a field to be eaten by dogs or die of exposure. And they'd say, well, maybe somebody came. We left them to the God's hands, like whatever. And a part of how Christianity grew is the Christians would see, babies on a roadside or in a field, and they would take them in. And so a lot of how Christianity grew was taking care of the unwanted, including infants. But infanticide was completely, utterly normal in the Roman world. Okay, nobody batted an eye at killing a girl baby, any baby, but particularly girls. Okay, so there's number one. So in the gladiatorial games, it's like, we can take you like a warrior, a fighter, strong man, and we can break you to the point that for our entertainment, you're going to march out there in that stadium and fight somebody to the death. Rome was completely, totally classed. It was a class society. If you're a shopkeeper, a soldier, a senator, you're at this level, and you would not imagine sitting with someone beneath your status. You sit with your status. And so if you wanted to go to the games, you went across the street. There was a big market, later called Trajan's Market. I'm sure it was something else before that. But you would go and get a ticket. Now the tickets, because they couldn't reprint paper like we can, the tickets were terracotta discs, like a coin basically. And it had two numbers on it. It had a section number and a seat number, very much like how we do stadiums to this day. And so the section number corresponded to the gate. So if you were sitting in section 7, you went in gate 7. And if you go to the Colosseum, you can still see this, by the way. You can tell that each gate does something totally different. Like each arch, maybe it goes up or it goes down or it goes in dog legs or something like. But each arch opened to a different section inside. There were no females allowed inside, with the exception of if Caesar brought someone with him, he was allowed to bring, his wife. Also, priestesses of Vesta, also known as Vestal virgins, could be in his section. Other than that, the only women in the whole place were prostitutes, and the whole top ring were prostitutes. Okay. So what would basically happen is, they would have intermissions, the same as, I guess, any ball game or sport, but during the intermissions, if you decided, you'd like to have a prostitute, you could look up to that ring above you and kind of wave at one like, hey, and the women could tell from where you were seating what gate you would come out of. They would meet you at the gate, and the business was transacted right there in the gate. Okay. Wow. So you didn't go to a room. You just did your thing right there. Well, what's an arched doorway called in Latin? It's called a fornis. It's where we get our word fornication. So that's how common it was. Okay. That's how both violent and perverted the culture was. Then you've got, again, probably the ultimate symbol of Roman oppression, which was crucifixion. But crucifixion was designed from the ground up to humiliate and torture and torment. Maybe your feet were a foot off the ground. You weren't way up in the air like is depicted sometimes. You were just barely off the ground. Right there by a roadside for passersby to make fun of you, laugh at you. Men lived sometimes as long as 3 days or more on the crosses. It just went on and on and on and on. And because you weren't that high off the ground and you couldn't move to defend yourself. I mean, things happen like, dogs eating your legs and flesh while you were alive, ripping your calf muscle out or something, or birds pecking at your eyes, and, just hideous, and that was all a part of the show. In a public place where everyone passing by saw it. And it was meant to say, if you mess with us, we will crush you. We will beat you down. And it was done all over the empire. Now, why do I bring these three things up? Because something happened with the eruption of Christianity. With the eruption of Christianity, you had people spreading out all over the empire who said, we think that humans are made in the image of God. That's what the Bible tells us. And that when you violate a human, when you violate their rights, when you violate their personhood, when you abuse them, you're abusing and violating the image of God. And God says that's his daughter, that's his son. And he's not happy with you. So that old will to power, it was what Greeks and Romans did. That's why they loved guys like Alexander and Leonidas and Julius Caesar, who just like raw, went out and fought and conquered in the name of their people. They admired that. And all of a sudden the Christians are like, I don't think that's the way to go. And things began to change. People said, maybe you shouldn't kill your babies. Maybe you should take care of babies and value them. People came along and said, hey, maybe making guys fight to the death for fun is bad. And people came along and said, hey, yeah, we understand there has to be a justice system, and that, sometimes, because the ancient world, nobody really thought about not having a death penalty. That thought doesn't really come along until 100, 200 years ago, 150 years ago, something like that. But they're like, but this long, slow, torturous death for effect, it's not okay. And all of that was based on Christianity. That was based on Paul saying, before God, there is no male or female, Jew or Greek, slave or free. In other words, God loves a poor slave girl as much as he loves the emperor. Basically what happened was all these practices began to just die out. as Christianity became more and more and more prevalent, and Christians, they didn't take over the government. They never really took over the government necessarily, but you have Constantine as a quote unquote Christian emperor by around like 325, maybe something like that. But what happened was all these practices, as Christians spoke more and Romans heard Christians articulate those ideas, they were like, yeah, you're right. You're right. We probably shouldn't do that. And they just began to ban these things. And by the middle of the 4th century, so by 325 to 370 AD, all 3 of these things were banned. So the Gladiatorial Games and Crucifixion is both banned by Constantine around 325. Infanticide's banned in about 374, 375. Okay, so you have all these things. It took a couple of 200 or 300 years for it to work its way through the system, but over time, the Christian ideas won. And so what I would just point out there is that from its very beginning, the resurrection and the power of this idea that the poor and the downtrodden, that the weak, the victim, you could even say, was good and righteous, and that they weren't actually being judged. The person being judged was Pontius Pilate and Caiaphas and the high priest, and they'll have to answer to God for what they did. Those ideas percolating through society just changed everything. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, click like and subscribe. It really helps us. And if you really enjoyed it, go on over to our website, thelandofthebible.com, and become a supporter. It helps us generate more content and gives you access to our full library of video and Bible study content.